invite Professor Kenneth, Professor of Chemistry and Associate Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, University of Oregon, USA. And, its presentation called Expanding Access to Experimental Science Through Green Chemistry.
Difference. In fact, I was interviewed in Thailand by a wonderful young woman, and she asked me what my motto was. And I didn't know I had one, but I thought about it, and I said, you know, make a difference. Do things that are important, not just to you, but to others. And I hope in some small way, working with my wonderful friend and colleague, to the others I've mentioned, that we're making a difference. Summary. I'm out of time. Let me just say thank you.
Thank you very much. A coffee break for 10 minutes.
More.
Questions?
You would have coffee if you want. Yes, Ravi.
This green chemistry thing worries me a little bit. Being 72 years old, I know things change in chemistry. Things that I used to do in high school are now forbidden. Like you're working with carbon tetrachloride, with H2S and stuff like that. In fact, with the things that I work, I should have been dead by now. There is no chance that I will survive more than 2 weeks from now. So the green chemistry is an important thing, but things should be dynamic. And many teachers, at least in Israel, say, well, in chemistry there is very little we can do because half of the compounds are carcinogenic and half of them are explosive. Something like that. And how do we find the balance between the two? I know the green chemistry is a buzzword now. Everybody is doing a green chemistry because it's very in, and we maintain the environment, not dangerous for the kids and the teachers. So.
Yeah, I love your question, and if I translate it a little bit, it becomes the question I raised earlier, maybe, is green chemistry robust enough science to survive, or is it a passing fad? In the end, it won't teach students properly, so we'll abandon it. And I didn't show you very many specific examples of the real chemistry we do, but one of my favorite that I developed at the university is a palladium catalyzed coupling reaction that generates a natural product through a cascade of steps. It's very sophisticated chemistry, synthetically and mechanistically. It uses palladium catalysis, and it's impossible to open an issue of a chemical journal now without finding palladium catalysis. You know, we don't teach it in the college curriculum, as far as I'm aware, beyond our experiment. So it's real chemistry, important chemistry, complicated chemistry. It just happens to be done using reagents that are safe and solvents that are not damaging to the environment. Can we ever replace chemistry with this sort of work? Will there be a time when students don't have to know how to work with dangerous chemicals because we don't need dangerous chemicals? I don't know. Probably not in my lifetime. But I'm really happy to be training students who will become chemists who won't assume that chemistry has to be dangerous. So I think if we do it properly, it's here to stay, and I think we'll start seeing more students like my student Peter, who go up into the industry and they don't accept the danger. They say, let's do something different if we can. That's my opinion. I'm going to talk to you about green chemistry, which I will define for you if you have not heard the term, and introduce to you the notion of how green chemistry can help us do chemical experimentation, whether it's on a desk in front of a lecture hall or in a chemical laboratory or in a room in a house or a school that has no laboratory. Before I start, I'd like to thank Mohammed Hujarat for inviting me to come back to visit you here again at the college, the opportunity to meet old friends and new friends as well. Thank him on this slide. This slide is from several years ago. Here's Mohammed. I know it's from several years ago because my little girl is now as tall as I am. She's gotten older. On this slide, I also acknowledge several of my other collaborators, Abdulaziz Al-Najjar from Kuwait, a number of Thai chemists, Sipawan Tantayanam, and the others that you see there from the school I work with, the school system I work with in Thailand. My Mexican friends, Jorge Ibanez and Carmen Doria, by whose grace I was here in Chichen Itza in southern Mexico, and several other colleagues as well. I work with people from around the world. It's one of my great blessings is to be able to do so, and it's a great honor to acknowledge, in particular, Mohammed Hujarat.
Just click the left hand button.
Yes, it is the left hand button. All right. I was getting used to things and doing the opposite side. I think Peter just demonstrated for us that chemistry is an experimental science. Even if we're theorists, my theorist colleagues talk about running experiments on their computers, so even they are experimental scientists. We work with chemistry sets as children. We work in laboratories in high schools and colleges. We do chemistry. And I'm pleased to be speaking at this conference. We had such delightful presentations this morning from Ruben, from Avi, Ruben indirectly, I guess, but from Avi and others, talking about the importance of doing chemistry. The problem, of course, is that doing chemistry can be dangerous. And I don't know if I have time, but I like to tell stories as our other speakers do, Avi in particular. The story I like to tell you is what I shared with a few already. I was speaking to a group of 100 older citizens of my town about doing chemistry safely. And I was up on a stage like this, and they were sitting even closer than Salim. And I said, I'm a chemist, I want to do chemistry. But it's dangerous, so I better get ready. And I put on the white coat like Peter wore, I put on my goggles, I put on gloves, and I said, okay, I think I'm ready, I'm safe, I can do chemistry now. And I reached into my bag and took out a bag of a liquid or a bottle of a liquid in a reagent bottle. Said, I'm ready to do chemistry. And a poor woman who was maybe 90 years old was sitting right in front of me, and she said, what about me? I'm not safe. And I pretended I didn't understand. I said, no, it's okay. I've got my gloves, my goggles. I think it's okay. And she was starting to move away. And then I said, wouldn't it be interesting if chemistry didn't have to be dangerous? And sometime later in my talk, I took that bottle and pretended to be thirsty and took a drink from the bottle. And everybody in the room was panicked. They thought I was going to die because chemistry is dangerous. Well, it was water. And I knew it was water more than Peter knew that his was water. Okay. Chemistry is dangerous. And so in general, we don't do chemistry like this. We do chemistry in a place where we can be safe. And we try to make ourselves safe by reducing our exposure. So we wear gloves and goggles and lab coats. We build laboratories like this one so we can do chemistry safely. Well, we do that if we have a lot of money to build a laboratory. That's a $40 million laboratory that we looked at there. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to operate that laboratory. I'll show you why that's the case, but it's energy consumption. And every now and then, somebody makes a mistake and there's an accident. And then chemistry is dangerous, even though we tried to make it not dangerous. Here's what happens. I like lots of pictures and not too many words, so I hope this works for you. We often talk about working at a fume hood. So here's a picture of a young woman working at her fume hood, doing things properly and safely. I sometimes talk about working in a fume hood. I bring my materials into that fume hood. Here's a student working in a fume hood. And then if you search on the internet enough, you find pictures of students working in fume hoods. This is a dramatic example. The student walked in. I've done this. Anybody working in a laboratory has probably done this. Maybe you're doing column chromatography and you need to reach the top of the column inside the fume hood. You can't reach, so you climb in. Your head, your shoulders inside. Suddenly you're not so safe anymore. I mentioned that these fume hoods are expensive to operate. I found a report from the University of California that demonstrates, I don't have the movie working, I can't show you, they found an improvement to their fume hoods that allowed them to save a lot of energy. And in the article describing this, they said that there are 85,000 fume hoods in the state of California alone, 500,000 in the United States, and operating those fume hoods with this reduced energy consumption would save this much energy and that much money. I understand the money part, I didn't understand the energy part, so I started looking. This is a dam on a river about 200 kilometers north of where I live, on the Columbia River. That dam generates about twice the energy savings per year that changing the fume hoods would create. So simply by changing the nature of our fume hood, we could save enough energy that we could tear down half of that dam. And this is hard to see, but these are salmon fish who need to swim upstream to have the babies. They can't swim through that, so they swim through this. We build these fish ladders for the fish to swim upstream, and I don't know if fish can be happy or not, but if they could be, these fish would be happier if they could just swim up the stream without going up the ladder. So we can make a difference to the environment simply by changing the nature of our fume hoods. But let's come back to this notion. Chemistry is dangerous, and so we have to be careful with the exposure that we have to these dangerous chemicals. The fume hoods, of course, help us control the exposure, unless we make a mistake or make an accident. We can also avoid hazards. A chemistry set, we were talking earlier about reasons, I think Ruben was talking about reasons students become interested in chemistry. For me, I was 5 years old. My older brother had a chemistry set. I thought it looked really cool and I wanted one, but I couldn't have it because I was too young and it was too dangerous. Now I could probably have a chemistry set at age 5 because chemistry sets contain things that are safe. That's a good thing. We don't want to poison our children. But the things that are safe in most chemistry sets are things like water, and sand, and paper. And the experiments, I'll put quotes if you want to call them experiments, that students do are things like measuring volumes and weighing things. And they're important scientific concepts, of course, but they're not really very exciting unless somebody like Peter comes and shows us good ways to think about weights and measurements. These are quotes from reviews of various chemistry sets on the web. People saying, you know, you get a chemistry set, but there aren't any chemicals in it anymore. But we reduce the hazard, so that's nice. So what do we do as teachers of science? Do we do exciting chemistry experiments and hope that our safety procedures are followed and our students make no mistakes? Maybe we can turn to video and computer demonstrations, and we certainly saw some very impressive videos, and I have no problem with seeing those videos. Yet at the same time, I think Peter would agree as well that if you only watch movies, it's not as fun as actually getting your hands dirty at the same time. There's a third possibility, of course, and that is we could simply not use chemistry laboratories at all in our teaching. But I think we've already heard the answer to that. And here, maybe I shouldn't be quoting Tom Goodwin, except I like to. Tom Goodwin at Hendrix College in Arkansas is a very good friend and a very good teacher. And he made these points that others have made today as well, and that is that we as teachers recognize that a laboratory experience, that doing chemistry, is important for so many reasons. Old reasons, new reasons that we heard, stimulating questions, reinforcing concepts, and so on. Very few of us want to do without the laboratory. And one important one I'm going to put here, I think, is that by giving students experience with chemicals, we can help them recognize when they need to be worried and when not. So when the whole room of my audience panicked when I took my bottle and drank from it, they wouldn't have panicked if they knew that it was only water. Water's a chemical. It's a pretty safe chemical unless you're facing it for too long. So we can teach students to think about hazards and understand them rationally instead of being afraid of anything that is chemical. I keep coming back to this equation. The risk of chemistry. Why is chemistry dangerous? Well, it's because we can be exposed to things that are bad for us. The things we talked about earlier, fume hoods and gloves and goggles, or chemistry set light, we're working to avoid exposure. Or in some cases, we've looked at reducing the hazard of chemicals. But if our focus is only on exposure, we run the risk of an accident. And the accident risk can be catastrophic. So here now we can introduce the concept of green chemistry. I have on here the official definition of green chemistry. My definition is simpler. I say green chemistry is the practice of chemistry with concern about human health and the environment. That seems simple enough, but if you think about how chemistry has been practiced from the days of the alchemists up until now, if you look at the chemical industry, we heard discussion about I don't know what direction it is, but the refinery just down the street from us here. Chemical industry is not done with respect for health and the environment. And the regular accidents we have and the injuries or deaths are indications that statement is true. Green chemistry, then, we're gonna do chemistry using our brains. And what this does is addresses the hazard part of this equation. So if we're working with safe chemicals that present no hazard to us, then it doesn't really matter if we're exposed to those chemicals or not. We're still going to be safe. If we're doing chemistry with water or with dilute hydrogen peroxide or with steel wool, we're not going to hurt ourselves even if we swallow these things or put them on our skin. So by worrying about intrinsic hazard instead of about minimizing exposure, green chemistry opens new opportunities for us. Here's what those opportunities look like at my university. This is our teaching organic chemistry laboratory for sophomore and junior students at the university. Typically, those laboratories are run in fume hoods. I'll show you pictures of our old laboratory soon. Our students do all their experimentation on the benchtop. I want to talk for a while about what that means. What it means for our students is they get to work in a beautiful laboratory. They get to see each other working. We don't have the fume hoods standing in the way. We have plants growing inside and outside. It's a nice place to study. But it means more than that. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes telling stories about what green chemistry can mean in terms of access to experimental science. I have a picture of a Eugene, Oregon storyteller to remind myself, as if I need to be reminded that I will tell stories. Here's our first green laboratory. It was built in our traditional teaching laboratory. You can see the fume hoods that our students worked in. You can see how you couldn't see across the room. It was noisy in here as well. But we started developing our new experiments to teach safely with safe materials, so students worked on the benches. The picture of the backpacks and the books is to remind you, to tell you that I came into the laboratory and I recognized the first time I really appreciated how different things were is when I saw that usually the students would put their books and backpacks on the bench and work in the fume hoods. Our students were putting their backpacks in the fume hoods and working on the benches. So we turned things around. The second thing I noticed, I came in, that's what this is for, I smelled chemistry in that laboratory. And I'm an organic chemist, I kind of like the smell of chemicals, but it wasn't a good smell. And I thought, I'm poisoning my students. We thought we were doing a good thing, but they're doing chemistry, and I smell the chemicals. As soon as I walk in the laboratory, they're being exposed. This is not good. But then I started thinking, I knew what experiment they were doing because I was teaching. We were using this laboratory for the traditional chemistry curriculum as well. And I'm a good organic chemist. I recognized the smell of the reaction. And it wasn't my students' reaction, it was the reaction that the other students had done in small scale, in the fume hoods, the day before. They were the ones who were supposed to be safe, and I could smell their chemistry while my students were working on the open bench top right then when I was there, and I didn't smell anything from them. As we started to recognize the safety of this chemistry, I made new observations. One, I was invited to Mexico at this laboratory. It's actually a hotel, it's not a laboratory at all. But I taught a workshop for teachers in Mexico about green chemistry at this Congress. Here are the teachers doing their work. We're doing organic chemistry again. You recognize what sort of room that is? That's a meeting room in a hotel. The hotel staff didn't know we were doing chemistry there. It was probably good.
That's the worst place to run a workshop. The temptation to go to the beach is so high.
He's correct.
Not good.
Ixtapa is like Acapulco in Mexico.
Yeah.
All you want to do is go to the beach. It turned out there was a hurricane while we were there. People didn't want to go to the beach. I just show some more pictures, and then I'll make a point. Here's a woman doing an organic chemical reaction, an alkyl condensation. Here she's isolating her product by centrifuging. We didn't have a centrifuge, but she tied a test tube through her shoelace. We did a second workshop. This was in the Yucatan, and Avi, this is not a good place to do workshops either, because the Yucatan's even better. We were working here again in a hotel. We were doing chemistry. A knock came at the door. There were 30 people waiting outside to come in for a lecture. We thought we had one more hour for laboratory. We didn't. So we gathered up all our chemicals and materials. We brought them to the bathroom across the hallway, which is why I showed the sink. And legally, I might add, we poured chemicals and clean glassware in the bathroom. That was and these 30 people sat down to listen to a lecture, and nobody said anything like, hey, it smells bad in here, because it didn't. That was when I really appreciated what we were doing in terms of the safety of the chemistry. We could do it here, we could do it in Ixtapa, we could do it any place. Shortly after that, I was invited to give a workshop in Kuwait for 60 high school teachers there. We did a variety of experiments. This is my favorite picture of all my teaching days for a number of reasons. Mostly, it's hard to see, but it's a very simple experiment, making a photocell out of a copper penny. But what I love is the excitement everybody shows. They're doing chemistry and they're excited about it. More excited than if I told them about it. While we were in Kuwait, I was there with my friend Jorge Ibanez, who you can see here. We appeared on the set of Good Morning Kuwait television program. I was famous in Kuwait for 15 minutes, talking about green chemistry. And in the course of our discussion, this is Abdul Aziz, talking with this gentleman who is the TV star. I was trying to explain to him about safety, and I said, you know, green chemistry is so safe, we could do it here. And he got very excited. He said, would you do it? And so 2 days later, we were back at the set. I had Jorge get his 15 minutes of fame, and he did chemistry live on Kuwait television. I don't know if people watch, but the fact is we did it, and we had a safe and a very exciting experience. Following that, I worked in the country of Thailand. Again, I'm going to make the points here. I hope it can show it. We announced a distance learning program in green chemistry through the Thai Distance Learning Foundation. I'll tell you more about them in a minute, but they bring live instruction through the internet to every school in the country of Thailand.
Ken, the timing is perfect. There's also the television of Israel.
All right, perfect. I hope my timing will be perfect in terms of stopping on time. I did 15 hours of chemical instruction for several thousand teachers through the internet. They were working in cities and towns and villages throughout Thailand. I was working with my student Jack, who became a hero in Thailand, in a small TV studio at the University of Oregon. And here again, the safety of the chemistry became very important to me, not only because I was teaching these teachers 8,000 miles away about how to do experimental science, but I was doing experimental science in a tiny little room with no ventilation. And if the chemistry had been dangerous, it would have been bad for the teachers. It would have been worse for me. We were stuck in this little room for 15 hours. The chemistry worked very well. There's another small message in the slide I want to show. Right here you can see an inset for Hua Hin. That's a town in southern Thailand. I was instructing and suddenly Hua Hin went dark. I thought, oh no, we've lost our connection. There were many teachers there. I was very disappointed. But then suddenly the lights came back on. And then the camera switched to some of the teachers and they had big smiles on their faces. They had been trying to make the photocell, the same as I showed in Kuwait, and it wasn't working. They prepared the apparatus, they turned the 100-watt light bulb on, and they saw no change in the photocurrent. And then they finally asked a question. Peter and others have talked about the importance of generating questions, and they said, you know, we're trying to see a difference in current when we turn a light bulb on, but the TV crews were standing there with cameras with about 10,000 watts of light shining on, and then they added an extra 100 watts. So they asked the TV crews to turn their lights off first. It went dark, they then turned their little light bulb on, they got a great photo current, and they were excited. The experiment had worked. The message there, I think, is the message that we've heard from others. By doing chemistry that's safe, we can encourage inquiry-driven investigation. If we're working with very dangerous things, I don't want my students to do anything different from what I told them they should do, because they might cause a problem. But if it's safe, go at it, experiment, see what happens, ask questions and address them. About 1 year ago, I was back in Thailand for a very exciting time. This gentleman was one of the teachers that I taught through my workshops on the internet. I was invited back to watch because he was teaching his students the experiments that he had learned through the workshops. So he's like my child, these were my grandchildren doing green chemistry experiments. They were in Thailand, or I'm sorry, in Hua Hin. You can't see here, but on this projection were students in the far northeast of Thailand who were also doing the same experimentation. They didn't have a teacher, but they had the computer interface and they could follow along. The school in Hua Hin where you saw that teacher teaching has 14 live channels of television bringing instruction to Southeast Asia. Live instruction when I was teaching my workshops, and then they capture and rebroadcast. So it's possible, I don't think it's probable, but it's possible that 60 to 80 million people in Southeast Asia watch my workshops in green chemistry. I think probably it's more like a couple hundred, but the audience is enormous. Why do I tell you all this? Well, I've already hinted at it a number of times, perhaps most recently with the picture of the broadcast studio at Oregon. Here's a nice $40 million laboratory. These are schools in Thailand. There are wealthy schools in Thailand with wonderful equipment and materials and facilities, but more often than not, in rural Thailand, you'll find a school that looks like this. And you know what? You don't have to go to Thailand. We could perhaps go down, I'll make it simple. I could go to a school in my hometown, which is a reasonably prosperous town in the United States, and find facilities that look a lot more like this than like this. High school laboratories. That's an awfully nice high school laboratory. That's a typical one. Here's a high school laboratory in Africa. And again, you don't have to go to Africa to find facilities like that. If you go to the elementary schools, that's probably what your laboratory will look like. It's going to look like the classroom. Very few elementary schools have nice rooms like that. If you're like me, starting to experiment in your kitchen, here's your laboratory. It's your dining room table or your kitchen table. And if you're doing something that's dangerous, your laboratory is probably outdoors. I was teaching a workshop in the Yucatan. I already talked about that a little bit. It was interesting. We had arrived, and they had prepared none of the materials. I talked to Peter about this. They had none of the materials we needed to do what we planned to do. So we designed new experiments quickly. One of them was very nice. It doesn't matter if you know what this is or not, but it was a very interesting, good demonstration of chemical safety in green chemistry. None of the teachers in the whole week of the workshop tried that experiment. And I asked them, I said, why aren't you doing this? It's a great experiment. And the answer was in this picture, which my daughter took. It was this thing here. They were required to remove solvent using a rotary evaporator. This cost about $5,000. Most of them were teachers at schools that didn't have $5,000 to spend in a year or maybe not even in 5 years. They said, why should we learn how to do that experiment if we know we will never do it? That got me to thinking, and while they were working on other things, I went back to this experiment and found that instead of using 50 milliliters of toluene as a solvent and adding 10 milliliters of methanol, I could use no toluene at all. I replaced the methanol with ethanol, which is cheaper and safer, and ended up with a better reaction. It worked better than the literature procedure. I ended up having a paper published with a couple of my students about that procedure. It's been one of the most popular experiments that I've developed. And I developed it because I needed to save money. Doing things cheaply is good. I'm looking to see if Muhammad is here because I'm about to start it, but he is not. He's busy. Muhammad Hujarat, this one is for you. Cheap is good, but free is better. And Muhammad is one of the world's pioneers, I think, in finding ways to do science, meaningful science, with equipment that is essentially free. I'll talk about this down. Just in time. I will talk again about this experiment, but it's a wonderful one. I've been working in Thailand, in other countries as well, and this led me to think about doing experimental science. I said I went to the Yucatan and they had nothing that I needed, so I had to do with what I could find there. But that's an interesting concept. I don't like this word developing countries, so I put quotes on it to mean that I don't like it. Honestly, I think the United States is a developing country too, and I don't know what it means to be developed just yet. But what I'll say is that in general, if you go to new places, what you find is they don't have what you have. That's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing.
So what is the red stuff?
That is carcade, or hibiscus. This is hibiscus tea, a flower. You can extract a red color from it, you can do chemistry with it. I showed us, this is actually something you can find almost everywhere in the world if you figure out the local name for it. But when you go different places, you find different things. And instead of feeling limited, I like to think that's an opportunity. We can find, what do you have? I was in the market the other day here looking at the spices saying, okay, we can do chemistry with that one. You know, what's available that you can do things with to teach science? And as we do these things, it's really important, I think, for that local content to be developed with the people you're working with. It's really what Peter's saying again, I think. You don't come in and show people something, you engage them with the development of that thing. I'll say here that as I've worked with these things, doing experiments, we do the baby diaper experiment too, in various ways. We do chromatography using their polymer, or working with flower extracts or native teas and things like that. Things that are safe. People start to worry and say, oh, are you teaching your students the right things? Chemistry's supposed to be dangerous, right? Things blow up or catch on fire or hurt your skin. So is this really chemistry that you're teaching? We've had people complain to us about this. The answer we give is who are we teaching? This, I think, for the university, but for you as well, if you're teaching elementary school kids or high school kids, who are your students? Are they all going to be chemists working with dangerous things? Almost none of them will actually become practicing chemists. They're going to become nurses or doctors or dentists or pharmacists. And I'll tell you that they don't really need to learn how to measure things using things that can cause cancer or that can burst into flames. And I do have to tell one more quick story. My dentist was checking for a tooth that had cold sensitivity. And and if I bit something cold or drank cold water, it hurt. So he took a bottle off of his shelf, put cotton in it, and out of this bottle he took cold. And put that cold in my mouth until he found the tooth that hurt. He tortured me like dentists do. And I said, you know, I've never seen cold in a bottle before. What is that? So he showed me, it was a bottle of an organic compound called ethyl bromide. It evaporates very quickly, and when it evaporates, it gets cold. Ethyl bromide is a carcinogen. So he was checking to find cold sensitivity in my mouth by putting a piece of cotton in my mouth soaked with something that causes cancer. I talked with him about this. He now uses ice. It turns out ice is cold also, and it doesn't cause cancer. I really wish my dentist had learned chemistry from my program, because then he would have never thought of putting that chemical in a patient's mouth, because he would know it was dangerous. And a quick aside here as well, we were talking about the chemical industry earlier, I think it was with you. This young man was a student in my undergraduate organic chemistry lab. He did well. He was taught experiments and illustrate principles of organic chemistry. We didn't really think there was any connection to real life beyond that. But he called me one day and said, you have to come up to Portland because we're running a reaction. I want you to see it. He said, we used to run this reaction. We had an explosion. We were on the front page of the newspaper, and it wasn't good publicity for us. He said, I took that reaction he taught me in the teaching laboratory and applied it to this reaction, and it works. And they were doing it in 8 1,000-gallon reactors, so 8,000-gallon reaction, a little bigger than we used in the teaching lab. And they were using reagents where if they had a problem, there was no problem. They were safe reagents. They simply mopped it up and put it down the drain. They were cheaper reagents than what they used. They got a better product in a higher yield. And what that all turned into was they were doing chemistry safely, and they were making more money. So Peter got promoted, he got a raise, it was a wonderful thing. And when people say, you know, green chemistry, we're not sure that's a good idea, I show them the slide and say, what part of that is a bad idea? This led to some discussions. Who's keeping track of my time? Am I way over, or? I'll start talking faster. We spent some time talking about what glassware we should use. Should we use regular glassware, like these things? Could we use small glassware like this, special kits that are available? And while we were complaining about that, it occurred to me that neither one of those looks very much like a 1,000-gallon tank reactor of industry, so maybe it wasn't really a problem. And at the same time, I was thinking, here's the school, the National University of Rwanda. They order chemicals, they may arrive in 2 years. And we're worried about what kind of glassware to use. Jorge Ibanez is an electrochemist. He went to Ethiopia to teach chemistry to these children. They didn't have electricity. And we're worried about whether we should use big flasks or small flasks or something else. We were being ridiculous. Let's segue to this. I was embarrassed by this, now I'm simply proud of it. This is a school I work with in Thailand. They invited me out last December to introduce or to open a new laboratory they had just constructed, and they told me they wanted to name it after me, so I said, okay, I guess so. And I got there, and that's the biggest I've ever seen my name. And I was embarrassed, but then I was proud. This brand new laboratory is for teaching new experiments for high school students. The laboratory is built not just for this school, Assumption College, but to serve as a site for teaching teachers from throughout Thailand, throughout Southeast Asia. And we're expecting perhaps to train thousands of teachers in the concepts of teaching green chemistry here in this setting. Here I was doing experiments. If you look very closely, you can see one, but I will illustrate it here. That's the same picture. I talked with them, and I was nervous about this. This Assumption College, it's a private school. The children come from families with lots of money. I don't know any simpler way to say it. They can afford a beautiful laboratory. They can afford glassware. They can afford expensive chemicals. But what I was telling them about was designing experiments not just for them, but for kids at the public school down the street or in the refugee camps on the border. And Thailand is like many countries in this part of the world as well. There are lots of refugees. These children don't have many opportunities. I'll tell you, they're not doing blue bottle experiments. They're not doing chemistry. They're not doing science. And my audience completely understood that what we were doing wasn't just for them, but it was for them as well. And one of the things we did was Mohammed's electrolysis of brine under olive oil. We had to use palm oil. We learned it's not very unsaturated. A terrific demonstration. Here we did it in a glass tube, but you don't need to use a glass tube. The pieces come from old batteries or motors. You can do this for free. And it's exciting. And as I was presenting this, one of my points was that we're doing this for high school teachers and high school students. But Mohammed, you've done this experiment for kindergarten students. Depending on what you say about this experiment, you can use this at any level of education. This woman here is a professor at Chulalongkorn University, and president of the Federation of Asian Chemical Societies, one of the most important chemists in Southeast Asia. And she said, this is a college experiment too. It's sophisticated, it's complicated, if you talk about it properly. What does this mean? Making it possible to do chemistry anywhere, regardless of how much money you have and what your facilities are. Well, what it means is we can do chemistry anywhere. And I put the flags on here of some of the countries of my collaborators where we're developing new experiments for children and incorporating them into their curriculum. This excites me. This is not all the world yet, but we're getting there. And this is my last slide, you'll be happy to know. A little out of date, but I'm not the only person, of course, working on these sorts of things. Those flags on the previous slide showed you. Together, I think we're starting to make